Okay. Well, the others will join us in a moment, I hope. But I did want to say, just as we open up this week, these last few chapters, especially chapters 5, 6, and 8, were really difficult. And they're just sections where John records Jesus' conversation, but you're only getting snippets of the conversation. And it's really hard to put the whole thing together because Jesus is saying a lot. And it's just difficult to figure out the flow of the conversation, I guess. That's very different as we get to chapter 9. Chapter 9 flows beautifully. And it's almost, I know it's not a difference. Jesus, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. So we don't know exactly. We do know that it was a Sabbath from verse 14. And again, they get into a contentious situation because Jesus performs this healing on the Sabbath. Where did this take place? Well, because of the man that was healed, this was probably a public gathering place for those who were infirmed and those who were begging on a regular basis from the people that were in the area. We also know that they had access to the Pharisees in this location because the Pharisees become immediately involved in the situation. We also know that Jesus knew where to find this man down in verse 53 or 35. We know that Jesus later went and found the man, and so he was able to locate this guy. And so you put those ideas together, and this probably took place in the temple area also. The lion's share of chapter 7, chapter 8, and now chapter 9 are all taking place in the most public place in all of Israel, in all of Palestine, in the temple. So, what are the events that we're going to see in this chapter? Well, we're going to see Jesus heal a blind man. And that has both physical and spiritual significance. Physically, obviously, that brings light into this man's world in a physical sense, in a way that he had never experienced, because the text tells us clearly that he was blind from birth. But then also, there's a spiritual light that begins to dawn on this man, because by the end of his encounter with Jesus, the second encounter with Jesus in this chapter, by the end of that, he is also spiritually enlightened. And the light has come into his life spiritually. He has become a believer to the point that he worships Jesus there, apparently right in this public location. Meanwhile, while this part of the world, part of the audience is being enlightened, on the other hand, others are remaining in spiritual darkness, and they would continue to just refuse to believe what Jesus is claiming to be. And then finally, of course, Jesus, as the light of the world, just continues to shine for all to see and experience, and his invitation to them remains open. The third thing that we want to watch for, and this is something I'd actually encourage you this next week, go back and read the account of chapter 5 when Jesus healed the lame man. Because there are a tremendous number of parallels between what happened in chapter 5 and what happened in chapter 9. There are a lot of similarities, but there's also some contrast. And it makes you think that John intended for us to see those two events next to each other and the differences between them. Some of the things that are similar about them, well, obviously they both involved a miraculous healing. One was a lame man, one was a blind man. Both were performed on the Sabbath, which resulted in Jesus receiving severe criticism, getting in trouble with the authorities. In both accounts, the healing takes place, and then the healed man is separated from Jesus for a period of time until Jesus goes and seeks him out. You recall back in chapter 5, Jesus went to him and found him and said, "Stop sinning or something worse is going to happen to you." And in this case, we're going to see something. Jesus comes back to this man with a question, and a question that will drive this man to his spiritual enlightenment. after he's already received his physical enlightenment. But there are still some differences between chapter 5 and chapter 9. Who had a role in healing the man? Well, in chapter 5, it's all Jesus' initiative. But in chapter 9, Jesus does some things, but he also gives the man some things to do. All right? So there's a little bit of a contrast there. Who provides the defense for Jesus to the authorities? Who provides the testimony? Well, back in chapter 5, only Jesus speaks up on his behalf. The healed man doesn't say much, and if anything, the healed man reports Jesus to the authorities. Okay? But in chapter 9, Jesus stays out of the defense. And this time, it's the healed man who provides all of Jesus' defense. Okay? And that's remarkable. And then the other thing is, what about the reaction of the man that was healed? The lame man, we don't really know what happened to him, but he seems to have been somewhat ambivalent toward Jesus, other than the fact that he was healed. We don't know anything about him becoming a disciple or trying to become a disciple or developing any faith. The text doesn't give us any information like that at all. But it's very clear in chapter 9 that this blind man, once he comes to see, he becomes a full-fledged believer in Christ. Okay? And it's very obvious there. So as you look at chapter 5 and chapter 9, they're similar, but there's some important differences to note as well. Okay. Next, let's take a look at an outline of the text. It's really very straightforward. As I said earlier, this account is very easy it flows. It's very easy to follow. It's not complicated at all. Verses 1 through 7 describe the miracle itself. Verses 8 through 34 are a series of different conversations, and there are 4 conversations that take place that are described. As we go through these conversations, they become increasingly hostile, as the Pharisees are ignoring obvious evidence standing right in front of them, the blind man. But as they go through these discussions, the hostility is increasing, but as the hostility increases, this blind man, formerly blind man, gains increasing courage, and he gains energy and vigor as he defends what has happened. And he begins in a very anonymous way describing what happened, but by the end, he is calling Jesus a prophet and telling them essentially that he has become a believer. Okay? And so the 4 conversations that we see are these. The first conversation is a conversation between the healed man and his neighbors or his acquaintances. And the purpose of that conversation is just simply to establish that the miracle really took place, that the man that was healed was indeed the man that was born blind. Okay, in verse 9, the man says, to answer all the questions, I am the man. And so he answers the questions of are you the guy who used to be here begging all the time and we're blind since birth? The second conversation is between the Pharisees and this man that was healed. And this essentially became a hearing. And they wanted to know the circumstances of how this took place. And there was really no consensus reached. And we'll see at the end of that discussion, the Pharisees once again are divided in their opinion about what happened. The third conversation then is between those same Pharisees and the parents of the man that was healed. And what happens now is the authorities, the Pharisees, attempt to debunk the story. And they say, well, this man never was blind, or maybe he wasn't blind from birth anyhow. And so they try to debunk the story. So they call for the man's parents. Well, the man's parents say, yes, he was blind from birth, but they won't go any further from that as far as describing how the incident took place. So the attempt that the Pharisees made here in this third conversation to debunk the stories fails completely. And then the last conversation, the fourth conversation that's described, is between, once again, the Pharisees summon the healed man back. They have a second hearing, and this time it's decisively answered in the favor of the healed man. The Pharisees, really, if you look at the logic of how the argument goes, they don't have a leg to stand on by the end of this. And then the last thing that happens in the chapter is that this healed man has a second encounter with Jesus. And this one now, rather than being about physical blindness, is about spiritual vision and spiritual blindness, okay? And so the second encounter with Jesus is what turns the tide spiritually. Did you have a question, Jerry, or were you just stretching?
I'm wondering about verse 4. It says, we must work the works of him who sent me. Now, who's the we?
Who's the we? Well, that's Jesus is talking with his disciples, okay? So that's who the we is, okay? But we'll get to that in just a second. So let's start. We're going to start here, and we'll work our way through this. Let's start with verses 1 through 7. I don't know if we'll get all the way. I don't think we'll get all the way through the chapter today, but like I said, this chapter flows very, very fluently. Okay, verses 1 through 7. As he went along, and of course that's Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. And while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. So, starting out with verses 1 and 2, what is it that this man, that Jesus saw? He saw a blind man. What did the disciples see? A sinner, and they saw a theological question. They thought, wait, this is a good chance to ask the boss. What about this? What about this situation? Who sinned to cause this thing to happen? What is the underlying question that they're really asking? I never really thought about this until I was studying for this. What is the underlying question here? Well, they're asking, is he responsible for this result himself? And if so, how can a man be so responsible before he's even born that he would be born blind? Or is this the result of his parents? You know, who's responsible for this situation? Is he bearing the result of his parents' sin? Because that doesn't really seem fair. Or somehow did this man himself bring it upon himself even before he was born? Go ahead, Lamar.
I think you can go another level and say, what in the world did they do, whoever it was, for blindness? That was a pretty serious consequence to say.
Yeah. So where does this type of thinking come from in a Jew's mind? Ron?
Jewish culture, they believed it was a sin that caused some form of issue or suffering or calamity.
Why did they think that?
Tradition was bad.
It's more than tradition.
The Pharisees were trying to control people.
No, it goes all the way back to the law.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back to the law. We're not going to read it right now, but write down Exodus 20 and verse 5.
Second and third generation.
And write down Numbers 14 and 18. It says that the iniquity of the fathers, the sin of the fathers, will be visited upon the children to the third and the fourth generation. That is what the law. So this came from the law, but it's a bit of a distortion of the law. Do you see that? That they have, by this point in their history, they are applying this situation to every case of infirmity. They're applying this situation and blaming everything on sin because that's what God said back in the law. That would be their argument. That if there's a situation like this existing, it's because somebody in the family tree did something wrong. And that's what has brought it on. So the law said that. But is that what was going on in this situation?
No.
How do you know?
Because it was only one
It's only one generation away. What else? Because Jesus said so.
Oh,
Verse 3.
Yeah.
Neither this man nor his parents sinned to bring this on him. That was not the focus. And so here's something that's important. Jesus, instead of focusing on where this came from, he encourages them to think about what's its opportunity, what's its purpose, what can be done to manage this. And so going back to what they saw, the disciples saw this theological question, and they saw this sinner there in front of them, or maybe his family was a group of sinners, but Jesus instead saw an opportunity, right? And what a difference that is. So when they saw the same man there, they saw it as a guy who probably deserved where he was at, and Jesus saying, no, this is an opportunity here. And what a difference that is. Now, I want to make a point that's an important point about scriptural interpretation for us. Because think about this. What they had done with those scriptures over the years was they had taken scripture that had a specific purpose. And what God was saying in the law was that he would, at his discretion, visit the sins of the fathers upon subsequent generations. And they would have to pay for the problems that their ancestors had created, okay? But God never said this is going to be the only reason that's going to happen. And here's the thing. It's very easy for us to take Scripture and apply it to situations that maybe it really wasn't aiming at. And this is particularly true for a group who rests on finding God's authority, supposedly, for everything we do. Because we can start inventing authority and inventing statements and making things up. Sometimes we're trying to put a round peg in a square hole. It doesn't fit, but we'll take that scripture and we'll bend it around so that we now have an answer to this situation that's in front of us. Craig?
You know, there's still a truism that exists today in what we're talking about. You know, future generations are paying for the sins that we're making. I mean, there's a phrase called kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
Our government has been doing that for decades. And future generations, somebody's eventually going to pay for that sin or those.
Sure. If you have a family that has one generation has a problem with alcoholism, is it done after that generation's in the grave? That problem is still in that family. And the results of that problem are still in that family. And you could go, it's not just alcoholism, it's any kind of sin. It does create problems for the next generation and the next generation and on down the road. No question. Lamar.
You know, we could even look at Israel's history and realize when they finally went into exile, it wasn't because just that generation was doing bad.
That's
They
right.
had been doing bad for generations.
Well, in the case of those who died in the wilderness,
Yeah.
you know, they sinned, but their children had to spend 40 years in the wilderness too. Right? Okay, so I mean, we see that. You cannot erase all of the consequences of the past in dealing with what's happening today and tomorrow. What about all the arguments that are going on between, related to, are things in this country, are they related, is this monument a celebration of our history, or are we celebrating the principles of racism, inequality that got us to this point in our history? What is it? Well, it's both. It has, there's an element of both to that. So those things don't just go away, no matter what. They don't just go away. And what I'm calling us to is looking at how we apply Scripture to real life situations. Historically, the Restoration movement has been guided for its first 130 to 150 years. It was guided by basically a three-principle hermeneutic, which means how you take Scripture and apply it. And those three principles were, number one, if there's a command, that tells us what to do and what not to do. Number two, if there's an example, an approved example, that gives us an idea of what's approved and what isn't. But the third idea is a necessary inference. Now, a necessary inference just means you take some verses of Scripture and you apply some logic to it, and you say, okay, well, I can make this fit into that situation. Let me tell you what, even a command could be it could have a limited application. When Jesus gave a command to his disciples, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's something we all do for all time. Okay? And let alone then if you get into the examples of Scripture, and now we make those binding, and then you get into the necessary inference idea, which gets to logic. So in the last, I'd say, 30 years or so, this command, example, necessary inference hermeneutic has been questioned across the board throughout the brotherhood and beyond as to whether it's a legitimate standard. Lamar?
Necessary inference, there's a lot of danger in that.
There is.
Because you can pull some stuff together that doesn't belong together.
Well, it's the challenge of, wanting and needing to have an answer to a situation and not necessarily finding Scripture that applies directly to it. And so we begin to generalize and we begin to massage things. And pretty soon, we've done what those Pharisees have done. We have applied that Exodus 20 and 5 verse to every situation that comes up. And God never intended to do that. Craig first.
Well, the latest hermeneutic that seems to be gaining momentum is what's called authorial intent. And that's wrought with danger as well.
Sure it is.
To determine what the author's
Intent.
was.
Yeah.
It's the same as necessary inference.
It is. It's a challenge. And, it's one of those things that in terms of, and I don't want to get off into hermeneutics here today, but it's something that we have to challenge ourselves with, because Scripture obviously is Scripture. It's inspired of God. It's profitable reproof, correction, instruction in righteousness, for doctrine, for those principles that guide our lives and guide our behaviors. It's important that we understand it. But we have to take it at face value. There's a danger in even doing something. There's sort of two major types of Bible study. You can do either what's known as we're getting way off now, but that's okay. You can do what's known as a topical study, where, okay, I want to learn about, what do you want to learn about today? What? All right, so you look up every single Scripture that deals with baptism. But then, in order to do that, typically you're pulling every one of those Scriptures out of their context. But the other type of study is an inductive study or a textual study, and that's one where you do like what we're doing and going through John. The challenge of this is you get these blinders on and you start to look at it without seeing anything else. So both of those types of studies have their dangers as well. But trying to interpret Scripture and make it applicable is difficult. And all I'm saying is, before we start binding things on ourselves and upon others, we need to be sure that those texts we are using are being looked at in their context, and that they are really saying what we're trying to have them say. Lamar, one more thing.
I think what fueled those three views of the hermeneutics was that the claim, we speak where the Bible speaks, and we're silent. So we feel now we have to have an answer for every situation, and the necessary inference is our whole card that we can play whenever we're not sure exactly where to go.
Okay, so that's kind of how we got into that situation, I believe, is looking for authoritative direction on every single bullet point. And you know what? As I look at Jesus confronting the Pharisees, it sounds a lot like them, doesn't it? So it's a caution for us, right? Okay. Verses 4 and 5, and this gets to what Jerry was talking. Verses 4 and 5, Jesus attaches now a sense of great urgency to the need to do something in this situation. He says, night is coming. He says, as long as it is day. He says, while I am in the world, because he knows his time now is getting limited. He has less than 6 months left that he will be on the earth. Okay, time is short and he could not fail to act. Also, notice in verse 4, as Jerry pointed out for us a couple minutes ago, he uses the word we. He doesn't say, I must do the work of him who sent me. He says, we must do the work. So he extends his mission and his purpose to his circle of disciples and to those who are working with him. We must do the work of him who sent me. And then in verse 5, of course, the thesis statement that we've been working on for the last several weeks comes back, where Jesus says, once again, I am the light of the world. And so he's attaching chapter 9 to what happened in chapter 8. And he makes that same claim once more. Verses 6 and 7 describe the actual miracle itself. And as we mentioned earlier, this miracle is kind of a two-step process. The first thing that happened was that Jesus applied this ointment of clay, we'll call it, but it was really saliva and dirt. And as I've looked at that, apparently that was commonly used for some types of eye infirmities back in that day, just to put a poultice or a dressing and an ointment on it. And certainly if someone had inflammation of the lids or something, or maybe a foreign body or something like that, you can imagine that that might help some. But I don't think it cured any other blind people along the way. Other than back in Mark 8 and 9, there was a man that Jesus healed with some similar actions. Interestingly, though, this word for clay or mud that gets translated there can also be applied to the word for dough. As you think about it, you know, playing in dirt and spit to make mud could be somewhat similar to kneading bread. Well, interestingly, kneading bread, mixing bread, was expressly forbidden to be done on the Sabbath. That showed up in the Jewish law. So this was a trigger. And John, if you're able to read Greek, you'd see that trigger right there in front of you. But this is a trigger because that was not to happen. You were not to knead bread. You were not to knead, K-N-E-A-D. You were not to knead on Sabbath. And indeed, in the process of healing this man, Jesus kneaded. Is that a word? Kneaded? Past tense of knead. K-N-E-A-D. Okay. But after Jesus did his part, then the man was sent away to wash in the pool of Siloam. And he was given, go ahead, Ron.
While you're there, do you think he did that just to prove a point of healing somebody on the Sabbath, or the needy doing something like that work, showing the work, but we're doing it for the needy? I don't know that he really had to do that.
I don't think it has anything to do with the needy idea. That's only in English that we have those two words, N-E-E-D and K-N-E-A-D. That's only in English that comes out. But yes, I do think that he did it intentionally to help them see that he was in violation of what they believed was an important principle of their law.
I think by this time, everything Jesus did, he did it intentionally.
It's very provocative, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Jerry?
Just a thought, this man came back seeing now. That is wonderful. It's a marvelous miracle made by Jesus, and he had a 20/20 vision. And we can put a lot of hope in that Jesus, every miracle is going to be perfect.
Every miracle what?
It's going to be perfect.
Is it going to be perfect? Well, it's interesting. He does have that one episode in Mark where, you know, he kind of half heals a guy and then he completes the miracle.
Look like trees or
Yeah, right. So that's a little bit of a strange story, but we're not talking about Mark today. We're talking about John. But yes, I mean, it's just once again demonstrating Jesus' incredible power across the board with healings, with nature, with, you know, making food and making bread and fish appear. I mean, it's just his incredible power and his control over everything. Yes. So that was Jesus' part of the miracle. But now we get to the man, and Jesus told him, now you have to do something too. You have to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And this might remind us of Naaman in the Old Testament, where the prophet told him, you have to go dip in the River Jordan 7 times. Now, I'm not going to do that. That's a dirty, smelly river. That's a sewer. I'm not going there. But nonetheless, he eventually got convinced to go do it. Lo and behold, then he was fully healed. So in some way, this appears to have been a test of this man's faith. Is he going to do it or is he not? Okay, so, anybody could have applied this mud. Did Jesus really perform a miracle at this point? Well, he did the first half of it, but nothing had happened yet, right? Okay, interestingly, John specifically says what the word Siloam means. And what does the word Siloam mean? Sent. So, probably, John is trying to help us see that Jesus intended to send this guy on his way to find the spiritual vision originally the physical vision, but then also to enjoy the spiritual consequences that would come from it. So this blind man was sent by Jesus to the sent pool to regain his vision. And he came home seeing, the Bible tells us. Okay, verses 8 through 12. Now, this is the first of those 4 conversations that we alluded to earlier. This is the first one. Verses 8 through 12. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" And some claimed that he was. But others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "Well, how then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. And he replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Well, where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. Well, his neighbors were confused, and they were astonished. But interestingly, now John uses them as his witnesses, and they bring credibility to the situation because of this conversation that they had. So John records what they had to say in order to give their testimony to who this man was, and that he indeed was the man who had been blind previously. The man's testimony is in verses 11 and 12. And it's interesting to note how he describes Jesus. He says, "The man they call Jesus." It tells us that he didn't really know much about him at this point, did he? He was in the dark. Bad pun. But he was in the dark about who Jesus was too. This then becomes the starting point of his journey to faith, which he achieves by the end of the chapter. We're going to see that as we move along. But also note that he does not directly attribute the miracle to Jesus. He just simply says, "This is what happened, and this is what Jesus told me." And so you remember who he's in front of. He's talking to the Pharisees. And he knows that if he says something directly that says, "Jesus healed me," that's going to get him in trouble. So he doesn't. He stays away from that. Instead, he just simply says, these are the circumstances. This is what happened, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. Okay? I don't even know where he is, he says at the tail end of verse 12. Verses 13 through 17, we move to the second conversation. This time between the Pharisees, and they have now called the healed man in to talk to the Pharisees directly. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. And therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" So they were divided. And finally, they turned again to the blind man. "What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And the man replied, "He is a prophet." Well, why did they bring him to the Pharisees in the first place? Were they trying to get Jesus in trouble? This was a sensational event. This was something that needed to be explained and validated. And these guys are the authorities. They know that stuff. In addition, Jesus hadn't been implicated, but he had been named. And certainly he had made a scene over the last several days. There had been quite a ruckus raised by Jesus, and at least they knew Jesus was connected to this event. And then finally, because it was on a Sabbath, this is something that the Pharisees need to look into, because that was what their culture was believing at the same time. Now, when they went to the Pharisees, in all likelihood, these are the very same men that we encountered in chapter 8. They would have been the same guys that Jesus had just called sons of the devil. He'd called them liars, he'd called them murderers, and he'd called them sons of the devil. And they had turned around and tried to stone him, and now here he comes again. Verse 14 tells us that this had happened on a Sabbath. Interestingly, John doesn't even mention that until the Pharisees enter the story. It's only after the Pharisees come into the story that the Sabbath becomes relevant, because the Pharisees, of course, see that as a Sabbath violation. In verse 15, when the man tells his story, he again describes only the events, and he still does not attribute the healing to Jesus. Okay? But meanwhile, what's going on in the Pharisees' camp is the only thing they're focused on is the fact that he doesn't keep the Sabbath in their eyes. They keep seeing only that instead of seeing this incredible miracle in front of them. And that's what John wants us to see. There's this formerly blind man standing there now able to see, and all they're focused on is this little minutia, this little thing about their interpretation of their law. Go ahead, Linda.
You really say that, you wonder who really is blind.
You really wonder who is blind. And take a look at the very last sentence of chapter 9. Well, verse 39, Jesus concludes this thing by saying, "For judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And then in verse 41, Jesus answers the Pharisees and says to them, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you see, your guilt remains." So that's exactly what he's pointing out, Linda, and that's exactly where this whole encounter is headed. Craig?
You know why the Pharisees are focused on, how we know that the Pharisees are focused on that one little minutia? Lamar knows. What is the therefore?
Okay, so Craig's pointing out in verse 15 the therefore, and the fact that this Sabbath violation is what gives them their ammunition. That puts bullets in their holster. So they're going to use that in every which way they can, legitimately or illegitimately. Okay. But the Pharisees, by the time we get down to verse 16, the Pharisees have fallen into two camps. There's one group who says, well, the fact that Jesus didn't keep the Sabbath makes him a sinner. But there's another group that says, well, wait a minute, he's doing things nobody else can do. He can't be a sinner and do those things that are clearly from God. But it's the blind man, the formerly blind man in verse 17, who sees the truth and testifies when he says he is a prophet. He's not going that far yet, but you can see him moving down the path, right? He's gone from back in 11, the man they called Jesus, to now in 17, he says he is a prophet. He's moving in the right direction.
Safe ground.
But you stop and think, he's been blind his whole life, and obviously he's a believer now.
Yeah.
And nobody's done nothing for him up to that point, so this must be the real thing.
Does it remind you of anybody else in this gospel? Samaritan woman at the well.
Yes.
Think about how she moves from one step to the next, and finally, I perceive you're a prophet. And then Jesus says, I who am standing in front of you am he. And she believes, and she tells all her neighbors and all her friends, right? So we see this man walking in parallel with what that woman did back in chapter 4. Okay, we will close it off there. We'll get back to verse 18 next week. God is good.
All the time.
And all the time.